Hello. Today I'm going to give a demonstration of how I would teach a beginner to throw a pot on the potter's wheel. It can look very simple to someone who has not tried it before, so it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. And so what I've done is broken down the whole process into 5 simple steps, and I'm going to go over those in just a minute. Before I begin, I'd like to talk about the tools I'm going to use to make a pot on the potter's wheel. And of course, I'll start with some carefully wedged clay. And the 4 basic tools I'm going to use to shape that clay are a sponge, a wooden trim tool, a pin tool, and a plastic rib. I also need a good supply of water nearby and a wheel, and I'm pretty much ready to go. Most wheels are operated by a foot pedal, and if I'm standing, I place this pedal on the ground. I think for beginners, it's actually a little bit easier to throw in a sitting down position, but after you've been throwing for a while, it's very comfortable to stand up. And in my studio, we have a lot of stand-up wheels simply because they use less space than sit-down wheels. So I'm going to begin this demonstration now by placing the clay in the center of the wheel head. You want a dry wheel head when you do this so the clay sticks. And I'll start just by hitting the clay with my hands and trying to get it close to the middle of the wheel. Okay, so step 1 in throwing a simple bowl on the potter's wheel is to center the clay. I'm going to start by turning the wheel on and turning it on a relatively fast speed, wetting my hands and then pressing down on the clay. The purpose here is to try to stick the clay down to the dry wheel head. I'm not really worried about centering it at this point, but just making sure that it doesn't move around on the wheel head. If I stop the wheel, you can see that it makes contact all the way around on the wheel, and it's a little bit difficult to move at this point. From here, I'm going to work on centering. One way of centering is by bracing one hand on the side of the pot. If you're right-handed, you're bracing your left hand on the side of the pot and pushing in. But if I only push in with this one hand, I'm not controlling the top of the clay. So as I push in from the left, I push down with the side of my right hand. Some people prefer to use a fist like this. I think you can see it a little bit easier if I do it that way. Looks pretty simple, but it's a lot harder to do in practice. Most times when I walk around and help students center their clay on the potter's wheel, it looks something like this. And they're struggling to get that clay to center. One concept that I want students to understand is it's not so much physically moving the clay to the center of the wheel, but putting your hands in position to guide the clay to center. And again, the way I would do that is bracing my left hand on the side of the wheel with my arm firmly resting against the splash pan and pushing in right at this point. If I were to imagine the wheel being a clock, I'm placing my arm somewhere right between the 7 and the 8. Almost a 45-degree angle. And as I push in with this hand, I'm pushing down with the side of my other hand. And you can see how that centers the clay. Students often ask, how do I know if my clay is centered? Well, one way you'll know is that when you place your hands on the clay, they shouldn't be wobbling or moving. If they look something like this, then I know my clay is not truly centered. Another technique you can use to help center your clay is what we call wheel wedging, or coning the clay up and down. The way I would do that is press at the base of the clay with the bottom part of my palms and squeeze the clay as I bring my hands up. I create a conical shape. This helps to get all the particles in the clay aligned and going in the same direction. At this point, I'm going to push the clay back down, but instead of an open hand, I'm going to cup my hand so that I can use my fingers as I press down on the clay. And I'll brace my other hand on the other side. So those two techniques should help to center the clay. But again, it's not an easy thing for a beginner. And this is just one way of trying to center your clay. Notice also that I'm using plenty of water. The idea is that the clay should be spinning through your hands at all times and not catching on your hands. And at the beginning, I'm adding a lot of water just to get the clay to the right moisture level so that I can work with it. Okay. Now that I've centered my clay on the potter's wheel, I'm moving on to step 2, which is opening the clay. To open the clay, I'm going to find the middle of the centered clay by pressing my thumb down on top. When I find the place where my thumb rests without moving, I'm going to press my thumb in, but stop before I hit the wheel head. So it's going to look something like this. Once I've done that, I'm going to open up the clay just a little bit. And I could, at this point, check the depth with a pin tool. And what I'm looking for is a bottom that's at least a 1/2 inch thick. So that's about a 1/2 inch. If I didn't go down far enough, I would simply press my thumb in further. And if I went in too far, I might be able to take some of the clay from the side and press it down and fill in the center of the clay. So at this point, I'm really on step 3, which is forming the bottom of the pot. There's 2 ways to do this. I could keep my thumb in the pot and draw it towards me, or I might just put some fingers in the pot and draw them to the right. I'll show you both methods. One method is keeping your thumb in the pot, pulling it towards you. Another method would be just using your fingers and dragging the clay out to the right. With both methods, I'm trying to make a wall that is nice and straight. And at this point, I have an inside to my clay and an outside. I want to spend some time flattening the bottom of the clay. So the way I do that is by pressing my finger down towards the outside of the clay and moving it to the center. And this compresses and flattens the bottom. Sometimes you'll get a little piece of clay coming up on your fingers, but it's really important to compress and flatten the bottom of anything that you create on the potter's wheel. At this point, I'm going to begin step 4, which is raising the wall. This is by far the most interesting step, and it's one that can kind of make or break the pot. The method I use is to use a sponge on the outside of the clay, a nice damp sponge, and 2 fingers on the inside. I should also mention that at this point I slow the wheel down to about half of what it was. That gives you a little bit more control as you raise the wall. I'm going to work on the right side of the wheel between about 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And I'm going to use 2 fingers on the inside and the sponge on the outside of the clay. Pinch the clay and slowly bring my hands up. Each time I do that, I call it a pass. So that would be 1 pass. And every pass I make, starting at the bottom of the clay and moving towards the top, creates a thinner and taller pot. What often happens is the rim or the lip of the pot becomes uneven. And there's a way to fix that. That's pretty simple. You would take your pin tool, hold it firmly near the end of the tool, and place it into the clay just slightly down from the rim. hold the tool steady, and trim away the lip. You could do that several times in order to get a nice even lip. And then we usually do a little bit of damage control by taking the sponge and compressing that lip and just slightly rounding it. So I should talk a little bit about what I'm going to be making today, which is a bowl. And I think the mistake a lot of beginners make is they start off making the sides of the bowl going outwards. What happens then is the force of the wheel keeps pulling those sides, and a lot of times the bowl will collapse. So the method that I teach is to create a straight-sided form and then gradually push the sides out. So starting again at the bottom of the pot, I'm going to apply a little bit more pressure with my inside hand and gently pull out the walls of this bowl. Always taking my hands away slowly. If you stretch a rim from a very small diameter to a large diameter, you need to go back and compress that rim. Again, taking my sponge, folding it over the rim, and just applying slight pressure to round and compress that rim. And look more at the shape. I might make another pass, slowly altering the shape of the bowl. Another tool that we haven't really talked about yet is the plastic rib, and this is really good for shaping the inside of bowls. The way I use this is by holding it at the top of the bowl and slowly going into the depth of the bowl. I can go right along the bottom of the bowl to the center, and then I have to stop. That gives the interior of the bowl a nice shape. Another thing I should mention is not to let a lot of water accumulate on the inside of your bowl as you're working. If there's water on the inside of the bowl, simply wring out your sponge and soak up that water. So the sponge is great for either adding or taking away water. The problem is if the pot becomes too wet, it tends to want to just flop over. So it's good to get down and look at the side of the pot and really get a sense of the shape. Now I'm on step 5, which is finishing. Okay, now I'm going to remove the slurry from the inside of the pot. The way I do that is taking my sponge and just using it to clean up any loose clay on the inside of the pot and also on the outside of the pot. The next thing I want to do is clear a little bit of the clay away from the bottom of the pot. I don't have a lot on this pot, but a lot of times beginners do. The way I'm going to do that is by taking my wooden trim tool and placing it against the bottom of the pot, angling it towards me, and pressing in. And you can see that clay comes off onto the tool. I can do that several times. That helps to lighten the pot and make it easier to take off the wheel. So at this point, I'm just going to clean the wheel up a little bit to make it easier to cut the pot off the wheel and stop the wheel. I'm going to take a wire and hold it nice and tight in my hands. One way of shortening it is using your fingers or your thumb. Holding it nice and tight and drawing it underneath the clay. Now I'm going to put a little water on the wheel head and drag that water underneath to kind of float the pot. Now that I know the pot is free from the wheel, many times I'll just slide the pot with my fingers and pick it up. But for beginners, I think it's easier to use these tools, which are called pot lifters. They work just by sliding under the pot. And I want to have a place to put the pot, so I'll use a board, and I'll rotate the pot and lift it and move it to the board. Being careful to pull the pot lifters out. And there we have the basic bowl made on the potter's wheel. Thanks for watching.